Let me tell you something about Luna Sera. She was not the kind of woman you looked at twice and forgot. No, she was the kind of woman you looked at once and spent the rest of your life trying to understand. In the entire history of the Crimson Fang Pack, no Luna had ever walked the way she walked. Shoulders back, chin up, eyes that cut through lies like a silver blade through flesh. The warriors, grown men, seasoned fighters, wolves who had survived wars and bloodshed, would straighten their backs the moment she entered a room, not because they were told to, but because something deep in their wolf recognized her, something primal, something ancient. The pack called her the Iron Luna, not behind her back, to her face, and she wore that name like a crown. She didn't smile to make others comfortable. She didn't soften her words to protect fragile egos. She didn't bow, not to elders, not to visiting alphas, not even to the moon goddess herself in her prayers. She spoke to the goddess like an equal, and somehow, the goddess always answered. There were whispers, there were always whispers, that Luna Sera was never meant to be a Luna at all, that she was meant to be something far more dangerous. See, here's what most people in the pack didn't know, or pretended not to know. Luna Sera held a bloodline so rare, so powerful, that 3 alpha councils across 4 territories had once tried to have her eliminated before she came of age. 3 councils. They failed. Obviously. Because you don't send wolves to hunt a woman who was born knowing how to make wolves kneel. Her power wasn't loud. It wasn't flashy. She didn't throw it around like some desperate she-wolf trying to prove herself. It lived quietly inside her, like a sleeping volcano. Calm on the surface, devastating underneath. Those closest to her knew that if Luna Sera ever decided to unleash what she truly carried, she could strip Alpha Dane of his title before sunset. She could walk into that alpha seat, sit down, and not a single wolf in the pack would dare challenge her. Not one. And Alpha Dane? Oh, he knew it too. Every single day. You want to know something fascinating about powerful men? The ones who are truly intelligent fear powerful women quietly. They don't show it, they don't admit it, but watch their behavior closely, and you'll see it. Alpha Dane laughed loudly in every room except the one Luna Sera was in. He gave orders boldly to every wolf except when she was watching. He was the alpha of the Crimson Fang Pack, one of the most feared men in 5 territories. And yet, in the privacy of their shared quarters, there had been more than one night where he chose silence over argument simply because he looked into her eyes and thought better of it. He wasn't weak, don't misunderstand, but he was smart enough to know what she was. So why, you ask, did a woman like this choose to stand beside him instead of above him? That is the question, isn't it? Luna Sera had asked herself that same question on more mornings than she would ever admit out loud. The answer was complicated. The answer was layered. The answer had roots that went deeper than pride, deeper than power, deeper than logic. The answer had a name. Love. Not the soft, poetic, flower petal kind of love that young she-wolves dreamed about under a full moon. No, the kind of love that costs you something, the kind that demands sacrifice and shows up anyway, the kind that makes a woman with the power to rule choose to support instead, not from weakness, but from a conscious, deliberate, every single morning choice. She chose Dane, she chose this pack. She chose to pour every ounce of her frightening capability into building something alongside him, rather than instead of him, and the pack flourished because of her. The borders were secure because of her negotiations, the alliances held because of her presence. The young wolves grew up with discipline because of her standards, the healers were funded, the omegas protected, and the pack laws restructured, all fingerprints of a woman who gave everything to a home she could have owned outright, but instead chose to build. But here is where the cracks begin, not with a fight, not with a war, not with something big and explosive and easy to point to. No. The cracks began the way they always do in stories like this. Quietly. A canceled dinner with no explanation, a coldness in the mating bond that flickered like a dying flame. Whispers that stopped when she entered certain rooms. The way Dane's beta, A man who once looked her in the eye without flinching had started looking slightly to the left of her face when he spoke to her. Luna Sera noticed everything. She always had. That was both her gift and her quiet torment. So she noticed the slight shift in her mate's scent, something foreign underneath his familiar warmth. She noticed the new name that surfaced once in a Border Patrol report and then disappeared, like someone had caught it and pulled it back before she could read further. She noticed the way the pack's energy had changed around her, not with disrespect, never that, they wouldn't dare, but with something almost resembling pity. And Luna Sera did not do pity. In the morning, everything truly began to unravel. She was standing at the great window of the pack house, watching the forest, holding her tea with both hands, the way she always did when she was thinking hard about something she already knew the answer to but wasn't yet ready to speak aloud. Her head warrior, Kess, came to stand beside her. Kess was one of the few wolves who spoke to her plainly, always had. It was why Sera kept her close. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then Kess said, very quietly, "He's bringing someone back with him tonight, my Luna." Sera didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't spill a single drop of her tea. She simply said, "I know." Another silence. "What do you want to do?" Kess asked. Luna Sera took one slow sip of her tea, set the cup down with a soft, deliberate click, turned from the window, and as she walked away, she said 4 words over her shoulder in a voice so calm it was terrifying. "Let him come home." And just like that, the storm had a direction. Chapter 2. She knew before the gates opened. That was the thing about a mating bond, even a fractured one, even one that had been quietly bleeding for months. It never fully went silent. It was like a thread pulled too tight, vibrating with tension, humming information your mind hadn't yet processed, but your soul had already received. Luna Sera felt him coming long before the sound of the convoy reached the pack house. She was in her study, books open, papers organized, a fire burning low in the hearth because she ran cold in the evenings. Always had. Her reading glasses were perched on her nose, the ones she refused to wear in public because she said they made her look approachable, and she couldn't afford approachable. Kess stood near the door, arms folded, jaw tight. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The convoy rolled through the main gates at exactly 7:43 in the evening. 3 black vehicles, pack-issued, standard formation, Alpha vehicle in the center, flanked on both sides. Sera knew the protocol because she had written the protocol. Every movement, every arrangement, every detail of how this pack operated bore her fingerprints somewhere, which made what was about to happen inside her pack house, on her grounds, under her roof, all the more insulting. She didn't go to the window. She didn't need to. Kess was already relaying everything in quiet, clipped sentences from across the room, her voice professional, her eyes burning with something personal she was keeping tightly leashed. 3 vehicles. He's in the center one as expected. Beta Reese is riding up front. He looks like a man who's been dreading this moment for a week. Sera turned a page. There's a 4th passenger in the Alpha's vehicle. Female. She got out first. Sera's hand stilled on the page. Just for a moment. Just one. Then she turned another page. She's... Kess paused, and that pause said more than words could. She's young, my Luna. Very young, and she's looking at the pack house like she owns it. The fire crackled. Sera removed her glasses slowly, folded them, set them down on the desk with the same quiet precision she applied to everything in her life. Then she leaned back in her chair, laced her fingers together, and stared at the ceiling for exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds was all she allowed herself. Then she stood up. Her name, Sera would learn, was Vela. And Vela of the Ashwood Pack, a mid-tier territory 3 days' travel east, known for little except their silver mines and their unfortunate habit of producing wolves with more ambition than wisdom. She was 23 years old. Sera was 31. She was bright-eyed and pretty in the way that young she-wolves often were before life had the chance to carve character into their faces. She had dark hair that someone had clearly spent time arranging, a dress that was just formal enough to suggest she'd been coached on what to wear, and an expression that oscillated, sometimes within the same second, between practiced confidence and barely concealed terror. She was holding a small bag, as though she was planning to stay. Alpha Dane walked in ahead of her, and the moment he crossed the threshold of the pack house, the atmosphere changed. It always did when he entered a room. That was the nature of an alpha, the way their energy preceded them, commanding attention and deference from every wolf in range. Dane was tall, broad, the kind of man whose presence filled spaces and made smaller wolves instinctively want to make themselves smaller. But tonight, for the first time in a very long time, he walked into his own home, looking like a man who wished he could make himself smaller. His eyes found Sera immediately. They always did. Even after everything, even now. The bond demanded it, pulled his gaze to her the way gravity pulled everything toward the earth. Inevitable, inescapable. She was standing at the base of the staircase. She hadn't planned it that way, or perhaps some part of her had, because the staircase put her slightly elevated, just enough, and the lighting from above caught her the way it always seemed to when she stood there, like the house itself was paying her respect. She was wearing a deep charcoal dress, simple, tailored, no jewelry except her Luna crest ring on her right hand, the one that represented not her mating bond, but her title, the one that had been placed on her finger by the pack elders themselves in a ceremony that even Dane had not been able to influence. She looked in that moment exactly like what she was, the Luna of the Crimson Fang Pack, immovable, unshakable, dangerous in her stillness. Dane opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Sera. Just her name, just one word, and somehow it carried everything, the guilt, the defensiveness, made the apology he didn't quite know how to form, the explanation he hadn't finished preparing, the hope, thin and desperate and almost embarrassing, that she would somehow make this easier for him. She let the silence stretch. 3 seconds. 5. 8. Long enough for every wolf in the entrance hall, and there were several because word traveled fast in a pack house and nobody wanted to miss this, to stop breathing. Then she said, very calmly, "You're late." Not, "Who is this woman?" Not, "How dare you?" Not, "Explain yourself." Just, "You're late." 2 words that somehow contained a universe of meaning, 2 words that made Beta Reese close his eyes briefly, like a man who had just watched something inevitable happen. 2 words that made the warriors near the door suddenly find the floor extremely interesting. And 2 words that made Vela, who had been standing slightly behind Dane with her practiced confidence already beginning to slip, take one small, instinctive step backward. Dane recovered, because he was an alpha, and alphas were trained from birth to recover. "We had a delay at the eastern border," he said. His voice was steady, almost. "I should have sent word ahead. I apologize for the hour." Sera nodded once, gracious, composed. "And your guest?" The word guest landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Perfectly chosen, perfectly weighted, not companion, not friend. Not the word everyone in that room was thinking but nobody dared say. Guest. A word that implied temporary, a word that implied distance, a word that came with an expiration. Dane's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. This is Vela. She'll be staying with us for a time." Staying with us. Sera's eyes moved, slowly, deliberately, from Dane to Vela, and Vela, to her credit, held that gaze for a full 4 seconds before her eyes dropped. 4 seconds was actually impressive. Most grown wolves managed 2. "Kess," Sera said, without raising her voice, without turning her head. Kess materialized at her side instantly, the way she always did. "My Luna, please prepare the East Wing guest quarters for Miss Vela." A beat. "The East Wing," Dane repeated, and there was something in his voice, something careful and controlled, that told Sera he had perhaps imagined a different arrangement. "Yes," Sera said simply. The East Wing." The East Wing was on the complete opposite side of the pack house from the Alpha and Luna's private quarters. 3 corridors, 2 staircases, and a very heavy set of oak doors separated them. The east wing was where visiting dignitaries stayed. Temporary people, guests. She turned then, unhurried, unrattled, and began to ascend the staircase. Every eye in the room followed her. Because that was what happened when Luna Sera moved. The world rearranged itself to watch. Halfway up the stairs, she paused, turned her head slightly, not enough to fully look back, just enough to be heard clearly. "Dinner has been kept warm," she said. "I've already eaten. Good night." And she continued up the stairs, unhurried, unshakable, gone. The silence she left behind was the loudest thing in the room. Beta Reese let out a breath so slow it was almost a prayer. 2 of the warriors exchanged a glance that communicated an entire conversation. Even the fire in the entrance hall hearth seemed to dim slightly, as if the house itself had exhaled. Vela stood very still, her small bag clutched in both hands now, her practiced expression completely dissolved, replaced by something raw and unsettled and unsure. She had been told things about the Luna of the Crimson Fang Pack. She had been told she was rigid, cold, too proud for her own good. She had been told that the Alpha had outgrown her, that the pack respected her but didn't love her, that walking into this house would not be as difficult as people made it seem. She had been told a lot of things, standing in that entrance hall, and in the echo of those 2 words, "Good night," Vela understood, with a clarity that settled into her bones like ice water, that every single thing she had been told was wrong. Dane stood at the base of the staircase for a long moment after Sera disappeared. His hand rested on the banister, his eyes stayed on the top of the stairs, long after there was nothing left to see. Beta Reese came to stand beside him, quiet and close, the way a beta did when his alpha needed steadying without the humiliation of being seen to need it. "She's calm," Dane said finally, quietly, almost to himself. "Yes," Reese said. "That's worse." "Yes," Reese said again. "It always is." Upstairs in the private quarters that smelled like cedarwood and cold nights and 8 years of a life built together, Luna Sera sat at the edge of her bed. And the mask was off now, not crumbling. She didn't crumble, but set aside, carefully, the way you set down something heavy after carrying it for too long. She sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the floor, and she breathed. In, out. In, out. She had known for weeks. The knowing hadn't made it easier. It never did. Knowledge was not armor. Understanding a wound didn't stop it from bleeding. But she had one rule. One ironclad, unbreakable, sacred rule that she had set for herself a long time ago, before any of this, when she first understood what kind of world she lived in and what kind of woman she would have to be to survive it. She would not break where anyone could see her. Her tears, if they came, were her own business. Her pain, if she felt it, belonged to no one. And her next move would belong entirely to her. She reached over to her nightstand, picked up the small, leather-bound notebook she kept there, opened it to a fresh page, and she began to write. Not her feelings, not her heartbreak, not the kind of thing that would make her look back and cringe at her own vulnerability. No. She wrote a list. Calm, precise, numbered, because Luna Sera did not fall apart. She made plans. Down the hall in the east wing, Vela lay awake in unfamiliar sheets, staring at an unfamiliar ceiling, in a house that had already made it abundantly clear. She was not welcome here. Not by the walls, not by the wolves, and certainly not by the woman who had looked at her with those quiet, devastating eyes and reduced her to a guest with a single word. She had come here thinking she was stepping into a vacancy. She was beginning to understand there was no vacancy. There never had been. And somewhere between the east wing and the Alpha's quarters, in the long corridor where the 2 sides of the house met and then deliberately pulled apart, the Crimson Fang Pack held its breath, because something had shifted tonight, something that couldn't be unshifted, and every wolf with functioning instincts knew. The Luna had drawn a line. Not loudly, Not dramatically, not with fire and fury and the kind of explosion that makes for easy stories, but a line nonetheless. Quiet, unmistakable, absolute. And the only question that remained, was Alpha Dane wise enough to see it before he crossed it? Because here is the thing about Iron Lunas, about women who hold their power like a sleeping volcano, about the ones who choose love not from weakness, but from deliberate every morning choice. When they finally decide they are done choosing, the mountain wakes up. Chapter 3. 3 days. For 3 days, Luna Sera said nothing. Not one word about Vela, not one question about her presence, not one acknowledgement that anything in the pack house had changed, even though everything had changed, even though every wolf within these walls could feel it the way animals feel a shift in weather before the clouds even gather, that low, pressurized stillness, that held breath, that electric tension that lives in the air right before lightning decides where it wants to land. 3 days of watching, 3 days of knowing, 3 days of being Luna Sera, which meant 3 days of carrying something that would have broken lesser women, and carrying it so flawlessly that if you didn't know her, you would think she was simply having a quiet week. But Kes knew her, and Kes was worried. The pack noticed things in the way that packs always do, collectively, quietly, like one enormous organism becoming aware of something wrong in its own body. It started with the kitchen staff. The head cook, an older Omega woman named Bryn, who had worked in the pack house for 22 years and had survived 3 alpha transitions, 2 border wars, and a particularly catastrophic incident involving a wild boar and the previous beta's retirement party. Bryn noticed first. She noticed because it was her job to notice. Because the pack house ran on routines, and routines were her domain, and suddenly there were questions about routines she had never been asked before. Like what Miss Vela preferred for breakfast, like whether Miss Vela had any dietary requirements, like whether Miss Vela would be joining the Alpha for dinner in the main dining room. The main dining room, where the Luna sat, where the Luna had sat every evening for 8 years, at the right hand of the Alpha, conducting dinner like a general conducts a campaign, organizing conversation, managing tensions between high-ranking wolves, making every person at that table feel simultaneously seen and slightly afraid. Bryn had gone to Luna Sera directly, because she was 22 years and she hadn't survived all of that by being stupid. She'd found the Luna in the East Garden, walking the perimeter the way she did every morning when she was processing something she hadn't yet decided to act on. "My Luna," Bryn had said carefully. I need guidance on the dinner arrangements." Sera had walked 3 more steps before responding. "Set a place for Miss Vela at the far end of the table," she said. "And Bryn, my Luna, make sure the food is excellent this week every night, no exceptions." Bryn had blinked. "Of course. Any particular reason?" Sera had glanced at her sideways, and there was something in that glance, dry, sharp, quietly ferocious, that made Bryn feel like she'd asked a question she should have already known the answer to. "Because this is my table," Sera said simply, "and everything on it should reflect that." The dinner arrangements turned out to be the least of it. By day 2, the whispers had started. Not loud whispers, not the kind you could point to and address. The soft kind, the dangerous kind, and the kind that travel through a pack like smoke through a keyhole, finding every crack, every gap, every space between walls where sound shouldn't be able to travel but somehow always does. The warriors whispered near the training grounds, voices dropping when senior wolves passed. The Omegas whispered in the corridors, eyes cutting sideways, conversations dissolving into silence whenever anyone of rank appeared. Even the elders, those ancient, weathered wolves who prided themselves on dignity and restraint, had been seen in a cluster near the Great Hall, speaking in the low, urgent tones of people who were genuinely concerned about something they weren't sure how to address. And at the center of every whisper, every sideways glance, every carefully unfinished sentence, was the question nobody wanted to ask out loud. What is the Luna going to do? Some of them had opinions, because wolves always had opinions. There were those, mostly the younger ones, the ones who had grown up in the comfort of a pack that Luna Sera had helped build, and so had perhaps forgotten what it cost to build it, who whispered that maybe she had become too rigid, too cold, that perhaps the alpha's wandering eye was a symptom of a deeper problem, that a Luna who made even her mate feel slightly afraid of her could hardly be surprised when he sought warmth elsewhere. These wolves spoke in the safe anonymity of numbers, never individually, never where it might get back to anyone important. They didn't know that things always got back to Luna Sera. Everything always got back to Luna Sera. She had spent 8 years building a network of loyalty in this pack, so thorough and so quietly maintained that there wasn't a conversation of significance that happened within these borders without her eventually knowing about it. Not because she was paranoid, but because she was prepared. There was a difference. Then there were the others, the ones who had been here long enough to remember what this pack looked like before Sera, who remembered the disorder, the power struggles, the alliances that collapsed, the Omegas who had been mistreated because nobody with enough authority cared to stop it, who remembered the borders that leaked and the treaties that failed and the winters where the pack nearly fractured under the weight of its own dysfunction, and who remembered very clearly the year Luna Sera arrived and began, quietly, unmethodically, without fanfare or announcement, to fix it. These wolves watched what was happening now with a different kind of feeling, not whispers, dread, because they understood something the younger wolves didn't. If Luna Sera left this pack, voluntarily or otherwise, the Crimson Fang Pack would feel it in ways that would take years to fully comprehend. She wasn't just the Luna, she was the architecture. Remove her and the whole structure would show its cracks in ways that even Dane, capable as he was, would struggle to repair. These wolves said nothing publicly, but they watched, and they waited, and they prayed, in the quiet of their own thoughts, that Alpha Dane was not as foolish as he was beginning to appear. Vela, for her part, was trying. You had to give her that. She was trying in the way that someone tries when they have walked into a situation they were perhaps not fully prepared for and have realized, too late, that the map they were given bore very little resemblance to the actual terrain. She came down to breakfast each morning at a reasonable hour. She was polite to the staff. Overly polite, actually, in the careful way of someone who knows they are not liked and is hoping that excessive pleasantness might eventually tip the scales. She didn't wander into rooms she hadn't been explicitly invited into. She didn't make demands. She didn't push. But she was there. That was the thing. She was simply, constantly, undeniably there. At the edge of rooms, at the far end of corridors, sitting in the West Garden in the afternoons with a book she may or may not have been reading, more present at dinners where she spoke little and ate carefully and tried not to visibly react every time Luna Sera said something at the other end of the table that made every wolf in the room lean slightly toward her, like flowers turning to follow the sun. Vela was not stupid. That much became clear. She could see exactly what she was dealing with. She had been told a story about this pack, about this Luna, about this situation, and she was sitting inside the reality of it now and understanding, with growing and uncomfortable clarity, that the story she had been told was missing several very important chapters. Like the chapter where the Luna was not a cold, passionless woman who had lost her mate's interest, but a force of nature who had simply chosen, so far, not to be a storm. On the morning of the third day, and something happened that shifted the atmosphere in a way even Sera hadn't fully anticipated. She was crossing the main corridor, alone. Because she often moved through the pack house alone, she didn't require an entourage to feel powerful, when she turned a corner and nearly walked directly into Vela. Both women stopped, a meter of charged air between them. This was the closest they had been since the night of the arrival, close enough to read faces. Close enough for the mating bond in Sera's chest, even fractured, even bleeding, to register the foreign scent of a woman who had been near her mate and respond to it in a way that took every ounce of Sera's considerable self-control to contain. Vela's eyes went wide for one unguarded second, then she collected herself, straightened, lifted her chin in a gesture that might have been brave or might have been foolish. The line between the two was very thin in moments like this. "Luna Sera," she said. Her voice was steady. Almost. Sera looked at her, not through her, not past her, at her, with that full, clear, devastating attention that made most wolves feel like they were being read at a cellular level. The silence stretched. 5 seconds, 7, 10. Long enough for Vela's carefully assembled composure to develop visible hairline fractures. Then Sera said, "You've settled in." Not a question, not an accusation. A simple observation delivered in a tone so neutral it was almost surgical. Yes, thank you for the accommodations. The East Wing is comfortable, Sera said. It was designed for extended stays. We've housed visiting alphas there, ambassadors, diplomats. She let that sit for exactly 1 beat. People who are here for a specific purpose and a specific time? Another beat. I'm sure you'll find it suits you. And then she walked past her, unhurried, unrattled, not a single break in her stride. Vela stood in the corridor for a long moment after she was gone. Her hands, she noticed distantly, were shaking. Not from fear, exactly, from something more complex than fear. From the particular discomfort of being seen completely, assessed thoroughly, and dismissed, not with cruelty, but with a precision that was somehow worse than cruelty. She thought about what Dane had told her before she'd come here. The Luna and I have grown apart. She's more dedicated to the pack than to me. There's nothing left between us but obligation. Standing in this corridor with her hands shaking and the ghost of Sera's gaze still burning on her skin, Vela thought, he either genuinely believes that, or he is a very good liar. Neither option, she was realizing, was particularly reassuring. That evening, the tension broke its first surface, not with Sera, not with Dane, with the pack. It happened at dinner, the main table, full attendance, senior warriors, betas, ranking she-wolves, the Elder Council. The kind of dinner that was routine on the surface and loaded underneath because every significant thing that happened in this pack happened first at this table and then rippled outward. Vela was at the far end, as arranged. Dane was at the head. Sera was at his right, as always. And because that was her place, and she had not vacated it, and she was not going to. Everything was proceeding with the exquisite, terrible politeness of people who were all thinking the same thing, and all choosing not to say it, when Elder Caius, the oldest member of the council, a wolf so ancient and so deliberately difficult that even Sera handled him with measured care, set down his fork and said, to no one in particular but loudly enough for the whole table, "I've been doing this long enough to know when a pack house is out of order." Complete silence. And this pack house, he continued, reaching for his wine with the unhurried ease of a man who had decided he was too old to care about the consequences of honesty, is out of order. Every eye at the table moved, couldn't help it, to Dane. Dane's expression was controlled, tight, the look of a man who was very aware of how many people were watching him and very aware that there was no good response to what had just been said. Elder Caius, I'm not finished. He never was. The Luna of this pack has conducted herself with more dignity in the past 3 days than most wolves manage in a lifetime. He looked down the table, not at Vela, but somewhere near her, in a way that made the point without being directly unkind. I would encourage everyone at this table to take note of that, and to ask themselves what they are doing with equal care. He picked up his fork again. That's all. The lamb is excellent, by the way. Sera did not react. Not visibly. She lifted her wineglass, took a measured sip, set it down, turned to the warrior on her left, and resumed the conversation she had been having before the interruption, as though Elder Caius had commented on nothing more significant than the weather. But underneath the table, where no one could see, her other hand was pressed flat against her thigh, pressed hard, steady, grounding herself in the physical sensation of it. The old technique, the one she had developed years ago when she first learned that the most powerful thing she could do in a room full of wolves watching for weakness was to give them absolutely nothing to find. She was fine. She was handling it. She was tired. God, she was tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixed. the deep kind, the bone-level kind, the kind that comes from spending years being strong in ways that nobody thanks you for, on holding things together that would collapse without you, and then being asked, by circumstance, by fate, by the choices of a man you chose to love, to be strong in this way too, to sit at this table, to speak calmly, to eat this food, to manage this room. To be Luna, while her heart was conducting a very different conversation entirely in the privacy of her chest. She was tired of being iron. She just wasn't ready to be anything else yet. Later that night, much later, when the pack house had gone quiet and the corridors were empty, and the only sounds were the fire settling in the hearth and the distant call of night birds in the forest, Dane came to the door of her quarters. He knocked 3 times, the way he always had, the specific rhythm that had been theirs for so long it had become unconscious, on automatic. And then he seemed to realize what he was doing, that he had knocked on this door 1,000 times, that his hands remembered her before his mind could stop them, that the bond, fractured, bleeding, stretched thin as wire, still pulled him here, to this door, to this woman, with a gravity that 8 years had carved so deep into him, he wasn't sure it would ever fully leave. There was a long pause, then her voice, from inside, quiet and even, "I know you're there, Dane." Another pause. "I'm not ready to talk," she said, "and you are not ready to say what actually needs to be said. So I suggest we both sleep on it." The silence on the other side of the door was the most honest thing he had offered her in months. Then, quietly, "Sera." "Good night, Dane." He stood there for another moment. Then she heard his footsteps moving away down the corridor, slow, heavy, the footsteps of a man carrying something he hadn't figured out how to put down yet. Sera sat in the dark of her room for a long time after that, not crying, not raging, not falling apart, just sitting, breathing, thinking, and somewhere in the quiet of that room, in the space between exhaustion and resolve, something in her shifted, something small, something final, like the last grain of sand moving through an hourglass, like a door, very gently, beginning to close. She had been patient. She had been dignified. She had been, God help her, she had been understanding, because she understood this man better than he understood himself, and understanding someone is both a gift and a particular kind of torture. But patience was not infinite. Uneven iron had a melting point. Even volcanoes, given enough time and enough pressure and enough of the wrong kind of heat, eventually erupted. She opened her notebook, turned to the list she had started 3 nights ago, read it once, twice, added 3 more items to the bottom. Then she closed it, set it on the nightstand, lay back on her pillow and stared at the ceiling. And in the silence of her own mind, in the place where the Luna ended and just Sera began, the woman underneath the title, underneath the iron, underneath all of it, she made herself a promise, one quiet, unbreakable, sacred promise. She would give it one more day of silence, one more day of watching, one more day of being the bigger person in a situation where she shouldn't have to be the bigger person at all. One more day. And then she was going to remind every single wolf in this pack exactly who she was. The storm had been patient long enough. And patience, in a woman like Luna Sera, was not weakness. It was preparation. Chapter 4. It happened on a Tuesday. Nobody expected Tuesday. If you had asked any wolf in the Crimson Fang Pack when Luna Sera would finally move, they would have predicted something dramatic. A full moon night, a pack gathering, some grand ceremonial moment worthy of the woman herself. Not Tuesday morning, not at breakfast, not with her tea still in her hand. It started with a chair. Vela had come down earlier than usual that morning, earlier than Sera. And by the time Sera walked into the dining room, unhurried, immaculate, not a single thing out of place, Vela was sitting in her chair, not the chair at the far end of the table, her chair, the one at Dane's right hand, the Luna's chair. The room had approximately 6 wolves in it at that moment, kitchen staff, 2 junior warriors, in Beta Reese, and every single one of them stopped breathing at exactly the same time. Reese, to his credit, had already opened his mouth to say something. He didn't get the chance. Sera walked in, saw it, and stopped. 1 second, just one. Then she walked to the table, pulled out the chair directly across from Vela, a chair nobody sat in, a chair that existed purely for geometry, and sat down, set her tea down, looked at Vela directly, and said with the terrifying calm of a woman who had made a decision she would not be walking back from, "We need to have a conversation." Vela set down her fork, smart enough to know this was not optional. "All right," she said carefully. "You seem like an intelligent woman," Sera began, "so I'm going to speak to you like one. No performance, no politics, just truth." She wrapped both hands around her tea. "You were invited into my home under false pretenses. You were told a story about a cold, distant Luna and a lonely Alpha and a space that was waiting to be filled." She tilted her head slightly. "How am I doing so far?" Vela said nothing, which was confirmation enough. "That story was a lie," Sera said simply. "This is not an empty house. I am not an absent Luna. And whatever you were promised, whatever was implied about your future here, I want you to understand clearly that it was promised by someone who did not have the authority to promise it." She leaned forward, just slightly. "Because this pack, these walls, this seat?" Her eyes didn't waver, didn't blink, didn't soften. "Still, mine." The silence that followed was so absolute you could hear the fire. Vela's jaw was tight. Her hands were flat on the table. She was holding herself together through sheer willpower, and Sera could see it, and she did not enjoy it. But she did not stop either, because kindness without clarity was cruelty in slow motion, and Sera had never been cruel. "Where is the Alpha?" That was Reese. Doorway, voice carefully neutral. "Get him," Sera said. Not loudly. She never needed volume. Reese left immediately. Dane arrived in under 2 minutes. He walked in still pulling on his jacket, which meant someone had gone to him running, which meant the energy in this room had already traveled through the pack house walls the way energy in this house always traveled. Fast. He took in the scene in one sweep. Sera across from Vela, the frozen staff, the atmosphere. His face did something complicated. "Sera! Sit down, Dane." He sat down, and the fact that he sat down immediately without argument, an Alpha who made grown warriors flinch, said everything about what he knew he was dealing with. Sera looked at him for a long moment. 8 years in that look. 8 years of choice and sacrifice and love, and this at the end of it. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, controlled. And somehow that made it more devastating than screaming ever could have been. "I have been patient," she said. "I have been dignified. I have managed this situation with more grace than it deserved. And I have done all of that, not because I am weak, but because I believed you were worth it." She paused. "I am reconsidering that belief." Dane's jaw worked. "Sera, if you would just let me explain." "I don't need an explanation," she said. "I need a decision. From you. Right now. Today." She set her tea down. "Either she leaves, permanently, or I do. And I promise you, Dane, you do not want to find out what this pack looks like the morning after I walk out of it." The room was not breathing. Vela was very still. Reese, back in the doorway, had the expression of a man watching a natural disaster with the helpless awe of someone who had always known it was coming but had hoped to be somewhere else when it arrived. Dane stared at Sera, and Sera stared back, not with anger, not with desperation, not with the brittle energy of someone making an ultimatum they weren't sure they could follow through on, with absolute certainty. The terrifying, unshakable certainty of a woman who had already made peace with every possible outcome. "You have until tonight," she said. She stood, picked up her tea, and walked out of the dining room like she owned every stone of the floor beneath her feet. Because she did. For 10 full seconds after she left, nobody moved. Then Dane put both elbows on the table and pressed his face into his hands. And Rhys, very quietly, said what every wolf in that room was thinking. "What in the world did you think was going to happen?" The line had been drawn, in ink that didn't wash out, and every wolf in the Crimson Fang Pack felt it, like a shift in the earth, like the moment before lightning strikes, like the exhale of something that had been holding its breath far, far too long. Chapter 5. Dane had made hard decisions before. He had called wolves to war. He had held dying packmates in his arms and made the call to push forward anyway. He had sat across negotiating tables from alphas twice his age and held his ground until they blinked first. He was not a man who struggled with decisions. Until today. Until her. Until he sat at that empty dining table long after everyone had quietly evacuated the room because wolves with good survival instincts knew when to give an alpha space, and stared at the door she had walked through and felt, for the first time in a very long time, genuinely afraid. Not of her anger. He almost wished it was anger. Anger he could match, anger he could argue with, navigate around, outlast. What Dane was afraid of was something far worse than anger. He was afraid of her certainty, because he had known this woman for 8 years. He had watched her in negotiations, in crises, in moments of grief, and moments of triumph. He knew every version of Sera that existed, and the version that had just walked out of that dining room was the version that had already decided. Rhys sat down across from him 20 minutes later, uninvited, unannounced, the privilege of a beta who had earned the right to skip formality. He said nothing at first, just sat, the way a good beta did, present without pressure, available without demanding. Then, "How long has this been going on?" Dane looked up. "The thing with Vela," Rhys clarified quietly. "How long?" A pause. 4 months. Rhys absorbed that, nodded slowly. The nod of a man doing the internal math and not liking the sum. And what exactly did you tell her? About Sera? About this pack? About what she was walking into?" Dane was quiet for too long. Which was its own answer. Rhys leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling briefly. The expression of a man asking the universe for patience he wasn't sure he had enough of. "Dane." "I know." "Do you?" "Because from where I'm sitting..." "I said I know, Rhys." "Then act like it," Rhys said, and his voice for the first time in this conversation had an edge. "Because I have stood beside you for 11 years. I have backed every call you've made, even the ones I disagreed with. But I will not watch you lose this pack over something you could still fix, if you decide to be the alpha you're supposed to be." Dane said nothing. "She gave you until tonight," Rhys said. "I'd suggest you don't spend all of it sitting here." But the day had other plans, because while Dane sat with the weight of his choices, the pack was already moving, not dramatically, not in the loud, visible way of open rebellion, but in the quiet, tectonic way that packs moved when something fundamental had shifted, and every wolf with functioning instincts was repositioning themselves accordingly. It started with the warriors. 3 of the senior she-wolves who reported directly to Luna's authority, her personal guard, her appointed enforcers of pack law, appeared at Kess's door that morning within an hour of the dining room incident. They didn't say much. They didn't need to. They simply presented themselves. Stood at attention. Waiting. Kess had looked at them for a moment, then nodded once. "Stay close," she said. "I'll be ready." Ready for what went unspoken, but everyone understood. Then the elders moved. Elder Caius called a council session for midday, something he had the authority to do unilaterally in matters of pack stability, a clause in pack law that had been invoked exactly twice in the pack's history, both times during leadership crises. He was invoking it now. The message that rippled through the pack house was impossible to misread. The elders were watching. The elders were measuring. And the elders had opinions about what they were seeing. Dane was summoned. He walked into the council chamber to find 6 elder wolves seated in a semicircle, their faces carrying the collective weight of centuries of pack memory, men and women who had watched alphas rise and fall, who measured leadership not in strength alone, but in wisdom, in integrity, in the quality of the choices made when choices were hardest. Caius spoke first, of course. "Sit down, boy." He was the only living wolf who called Dane boy and kept his head. Dane sat. "We are not here to lecture you on your personal life," Caius said. "We are Alpha's elders, not your parents. What you do with your heart is your own catastrophe to manage." He folded his hands on the table. "What we are here to discuss is the pack." "The pack is fine," Dane said. The silence that followed that statement was the most eloquent response it could have received. "The pack," said Elder Mira, a small, sharp woman who spoke rarely and devastatingly, "has been fine because of your Luna, specifically, measurably, documentably." She slid a single piece of paper across the table toward him. "We took the liberty of compiling a summary." Dane looked down at the paper. It was a list. Alliance treaties negotiated or maintained, 17. Border disputes resolved without bloodshed, 9. Pack law reforms initiated, 23. Omega welfare initiatives, 12. Diplomatic relationships personally maintained by the Luna, 31. These, Elder Mira said, do not maintain themselves. They are maintained by relationships, by trust, by the specific reputation of a specific woman who has spent 8 years making this pack something other packs respect. She let him read it fully. "Ask yourself, Alpha, if that woman walks out of those gates, how many of those 31 relationships walk out with her?" The answer settled into Dane's chest like a stone into deep water, slow, heavy, a sinking somewhere he couldn't reach. He had known, intellectually, what Sera contributed to this pack. He had always known, but knowing something intellectually and feeling the full weight of it were 2 profoundly different experiences. He had spent 4 months telling himself a story. The story went, "The pack is strong enough to sustain any personal transition. Leadership is about the Alpha. The Luna is important but replaceable. This is manageable." Sitting in this council chamber, looking at that piece of paper, surrounded by 6 ancient wolves who had collectively watched more packs collapse than he had years of life, the story fell apart. He found Vela in the East Wing at mid-afternoon. She was packed, not halfway packed, not tentatively packed, fully, completely, everything in bags packed. And sitting on the edge of the bed, in a room that already looked like she had never been in it, because she was the kind of woman who left spaces the way she found them. She looked up when he appeared in the doorway, and on her face was an expression he hadn't expected, not hurt, not anger, not the wounded devastation of someone who felt betrayed, relief. "You don't have to say it," she said. "Vela?" "Dane." Her voice was quiet, firm. "I've been thinking since this morning, since she sat down across from me and told me the truth that you should have told me before I ever set foot in this place." He opened his mouth. "She wasn't cruel," Vela continued. "That's the thing. I came here prepared to dislike her. I was given every reason to dislike her. And she sat across from me and told me the truth with more respect than the situation required." She looked at him steadily. "You told me she was cold, that she didn't love you anymore, that there was nothing left." Silence. "That woman," Vela said, "is not a woman who has stopped loving someone. That woman is a woman who is deciding whether the person she loves still deserves it." She stood, picked up her bag. "There's a difference, and I think you know that." She walked past him to the door, stopped. "For what it's worth, I hope you figure it out." A pause. "She's extraordinary, Dane, and you've been acting like she's ordinary. That's the whole problem." And she left. He stood in the empty East Wing room for a long time, alone with the particular silence of a space that had briefly held something and now held nothing, alone with a sentence that kept repeating in his chest like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. "You've been acting like she's ordinary." The bond hit him at sundown, That was the only way to describe it. Hit. Like something that had been straining against a restraint finally snapped loose and came rushing back. The mating bond, which had been a thin, fractured, barely there thread for months, frayed by distance and choices and the particular damage of betrayal, flooded back with an intensity that drove him to one knee in the corridor outside her door. Actual knee. On the floor, a hand braced against the wall. Because the bond wasn't just pain, though there was pain. And deep and clarifying, it was information. Every mating bond carried the emotional frequency of its other half, and what came through in that moment from her side of it was exhausting, not rage, not devastation, not the explosive grief he might have expected, just exhaustion. The profound, bone-deep tiredness of a woman who had been strong for too long in too many directions and was standing at the edge of a decision she had never wanted to make. And underneath the exhaustion, something that wrecked him completely. Underneath it, she still loved him, quietly, painfully, against her better judgment and her pride and every logical argument she could make to herself. She still loved him. He pressed his forehead against the door. And Alpha Dane, feared across 5 territories, obeyed by hundreds, a man who had not cried since he was 9 years old at his father's graveside, set her name into the wood, barely a whisper. Sera. A long silence, then from inside, her voice, quiet, steady, tired in a way that broke something in him. I know. Just that. I know. The reckoning had arrived. Not with fire, not with fury, but with the quiet, devastating truth that the most powerful thing Dane had ever possessed, he had nearly been thrown away. And the most frightening question he had ever faced wasn't across a negotiating table, it was on the other side of this door. Would she let him in? Chapter 6. She didn't open the door. She let him stand there. Not out of cruelty. Sera had never been cruel. But because some moments deserved their full weight, because some thresholds, once crossed, could not be uncrossed, and because she needed, for herself, for the woman underneath the Luna, underneath the iron, underneath all of it, she needed to be completely sure of what she was about to do, so she sat in her chair by the window, and she thought. She thought about the girl she had been before this pack, before this title, before Dane. A young she-wolf who had been feared before she was understood, who had learned early that power without wisdom was just destruction with better posture, who had chosen, consciously, deliberately chosen, to use what she carried not to dominate but to build. She had built this. In all of it, every alliance, every treaty, every Omega who slept safely tonight, every warrior who fought with discipline instead of chaos, every corridor of this pack house that hummed with the quiet, invisible infrastructure of her 8 years of relentless, thankless, extraordinary work. She had built it alongside a man she loved, a man who had looked at everything she built and still looked elsewhere. The bond pulsed, his side of it, raw, open, stripped of the careful management he usually applied to everything. She could feel him on the other side of that door the way you feel weather changing. The guilt, the grief, the terrible, clarifying reckoning of a man who had finally stopped lying to himself, and underneath all of it, his love for her, still there, still real, battered and ashamed of itself, but present, the way a fire is present even under ash, still burning. She closed her eyes, breathed, and made her choice. She opened the door. Dane was exactly as the bond had told her he would be, undone. Not performance, not strategy. Just a man standing in a corridor holding the wreckage of his own choices and not sure where to set it down. He looked at her like she was something he had forgotten how to deserve. She looked at him like she was still deciding whether to let him try. "Come in," she said. He came in. She walked to the center of the room and turned to face him, arms at her sides, nothing between them but air and 8 years and everything that needed to be said. "You don't get to explain first," she said. "I speak. You listen. Then you decide what kind of man you are. Are we clear?" "Yes." She didn't raise her voice once. She didn't need to. "I chose you," she began. "Every day for 8 years I chose you, not because I had to, not because the bond demanded it, but because I looked at you and I decided, this man is worth extraordinary, this man is worth what I carry." She took one step toward him. "I gave this pack everything I had. I gave you everything I had. And while I was giving, you were somewhere else, telling someone else a story about a cold and distant Luna as justification for what you already wanted to do." She tilted her head. "Do you know what the most insulting part is? Not the betrayal, not the mistress in my house in my chair at my table." Her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that could have stopped weather. "The most insulting part is that you tried to make me small in someone else's eyes, to make yourself feel better about what you were doing. Sera, I said you listen." He closed his mouth. "I have spent 3 days deciding something," she continued. "Not whether to stay or go. That decision is more complicated than people think, and I will not be rushed into it by an ultimatum I gave myself." A pause. "What I have been deciding is who I am going to be after this. Regardless of what you choose, regardless of what this pack needs, regardless of everything external." She stopped directly in front of him now, close enough that the bond between them was almost audible, a frequency, a vibration, something ancient and insistent and not remotely finished with either of them. "And here is what I decided." Her voice dropped, quieter now, but somehow louder for it. "I am Luna Sera of the Crimson Fang Pack. I carry a bloodline that 3 alpha councils tried to erase before I came of age. I have the power to dismantle everything in this territory and rebuild it under my own name before the season changes. I have always chosen, to stand beside you instead." She looked at him. "That choice is not gone yet. But Dane," she said his name the way she said very few things, without armor, "it is standing at the door, and it will not wait much longer." Dane broke, not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, the way real things break, not with a crash, but with a sound like something finally releasing. His shoulders dropped, his jaw worked, his eyes, which had been holding steady through sheer alpha conditioning, were filled with something unguarded and unmanaged and completely devastatingly genuine. "I don't have an excuse," he said. His voice was rough. "I have explanations, reasons, the kind of things people say when they're trying to make a wrong thing make sense, but I'm not going to insult you with them." He held her gaze. "I got comfortable," he said. "That's the truth. The real truth. I got comfortable with your strength. I stopped seeing it as something extraordinary and started treating it as something I was entitled to, and when I felt something slipping between us, something I should have come to you about, fought for, fixed, I went somewhere easier instead." A pause. "You deserved better. You have always deserved better, and the worst part—" His voice fractured slightly on that. "The worst part is that I knew that. I knew exactly what you were, I knew exactly what I had, and I chose smaller." He exhaled. "I am so sorry, Sera. Not, I'm sorry you feel this way. Not, I'm sorry if I hurt you. I am sorry. Full stop, no conditions, no exits." She looked at him for a long time, reading him the way she read everything, thoroughly, carefully, looking for the hairline fractures where performance ended and truth began. She found the truth. It didn't fix everything. It didn't erase anything. But it was real. And Sera had always been able to work with reality. "Here is what happens now," she said finally. Her voice had shifted, still quiet. But the quality of it had changed, less wound, more Luna. "You are going to go before the pack tomorrow morning, full assembly, every wolf, every rank, every elder. And you are going to say, clearly, publicly, without ambiguity, what this was, what it was not, and where we stand." "Sera." "Publicly," she repeated, "because this happened publicly. She was brought here publicly. The pack has been watching publicly. And I will not have my dignity restored in a private room while the pack whispers in corridors." He nodded. "And after that?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "After that," she said, "we find out if there is an after that." Not a yes. Not a no. A door. Barely open. But open. The full pack assembly was called for dawn. Word traveled through the pack house overnight the way important things always did. Fast, electric, impossible to contain. By the time the sun crested the eastern tree line, every wolf in the Crimson Fang Pack was gathered in the great courtyard. Warriors in formation, omegas near the back, elders in their seats at the front, the entire senior council, the entire junior council, wolves who had been here for decades and wolves who had arrived last season, all of them in the gray-gold light of early morning, watching the steps of the pack house. Waiting. Dane came out first. He stood at the top of the steps in full alpha formality, his rank markings visible, his posture straight, his face carrying the particular gravity of a man who had decided to stop managing his image and start managing his integrity. He waited. Then he turned and held out his hand. Sera appeared in the doorway, and the pack, the entire Crimson Fang Pack, went absolutely silent. Not the silence of shock, the silence of recognition. The silence of hundreds of wolves looking at something and every primal, ancient, deep wolf part of them responding to it before their minds could articulate why. She was dressed in pack colors, deep crimson and black, the formal Luna ceremonial colors she wore only on the most significant occasions. Her Luna crest was at her throat, her crest ring was on her hand, her hair was back, her spine was straight. She looked like what she was. She looked like what she had always been. She looked like the reason this pack was still standing. She did not take his hand immediately. She stood in the doorway for one long moment and looked out at her pack. Her wolves. The faces she knew, the warriors she had trained alongside, the omegas she had protected, the young wolves who had grown up in a pack shaped by her standards. She looked at all of them, and something moved across her face. Not softness exactly, something older than softness, something that had been there the whole time underneath the iron, underneath the dignity, underneath the unshakable composure, love, fierce, complicated, non-negotiable love for this pack she had given everything to build. She took his hand, and the sound that went through the assembled pack was not a cheer, it was something more involuntary than that, a collective exhale, a release. Like every wolf present had been holding something in their chest for days and had just been given permission to put it down. Dane turned to face his pack. 3 days ago, he said, his voice carrying across the courtyard with alpha clarity, I made choices that dishonored this pack, that dishonored my bond. That dishonored the woman standing beside me, a woman who has given more to the Crimson Fang Pack than I have adequately acknowledged or protected. Not a sound from the crowd. I brought a stranger into our home. I allowed a situation to exist that should never have been permitted, and I did it while telling myself stories that were convenient and false. His jaw tightened. I am your alpha, and I failed the standard I am supposed to hold. He looked out at them. That ends today. Then something happened that nobody had planned, nobody had asked for, nobody would ever fully be able to explain. Elder Caius stood up, the oldest wolf in the pack, the one who had called emergency councils and survived alpha transitions and watched this pack through every storm it had ever weathered. He stood up from his elder seat, slowly, with the deliberate effort of very old bones, and he turned to face Luna Sera, and he bowed, not the small, formal inclination of protocol, a full bow, deep, held, the bow you gave to someone who had earned something beyond their title. The warrior to his left stood and bowed, then the one beside her, then the senior she-wolves, then the junior council, then the warriors in formation, one by one, and then all at once. A wave moving through the courtyard like wind through long grass, wolves bowing, not to the alpha, to the Luna, to Sera. She did not cry. Of course she didn't cry. But something happened in her eyes, something that Dane, standing close enough to see it, would carry with him for the rest of his life, something that cracked through the iron just for a moment. Something that looked like a woman finally, being seen at the full measure of what she actually was. Not just the Luna, not just the Iron Woman, not just the power behind the throne or the architect of someone else's legacy, but herself, fully, completely, without apology. She squeezed Dane's hand once, hard. The squeeze that said, "This is not forgiveness yet. This is not healed. This is not simple." He squeezed back. The squeeze that said, "I know. I will spend however long it takes." Then she descended the steps, walked into her pack. And they parted for her the way water parted for something that belonged in it, naturally, inevitably. Like there had never been any question of where she was supposed to be. Kes fell into step on her left, her guard fell in around her. And Luna Sera walked through the Crimson Fang Pack, through her wolves, her alliances, her 8 years of thankless, extraordinary work made visible in every face that turned toward her, with her head up, her spine is straight, her eyes clear. She had not won because she fought loudest. She had not risen because she destroyed something on her way up. She had risen the way all truly powerful things rise, by being so completely, immovably, magnificently themselves, that the world had no choice but to rearrange around them. The Iron Luna had drawn her line, the Alpha had crossed it, and then crossed back. The pack had chosen, and Sera had done what she had always done, what she would always do. She had remained, unbroken, unbowed, entirely, devastatingly herself, and that, it was the most powerful thing she had ever done,